do y'all talk about cannabis in your practices? Okay. How knowledgeable and comfortable in general do you feel talking about cannabis when you need to? All right. Now we're in Denver, right? So got lots of quasi-sixes out there is what I'm seeing. I have to admit, I have about 2 hours of content packed into this, and so I'm going to not give you 2 hours of content. So there will be some slides I go through more quickly because you've been in Denver living and working, and you probably know some of the background. So forgive me if I'm going through some of that. So this is part of what I usually talk about outside of Colorado is what have you heard? It's not addictive. It's easy to control the use. Proponents of legalization understand the true science of cannabis. Now, in some ways, that's true. They have gone further in research than a lot of the others. And unfortunately, a lot of psychology is stuck in finger-waggling about a lot of substances, cannabis in particular. It's natural, it's organic, and it's harmless. My favorite counter to that one is, well, lithium is a salt as well. And is that natural and organic as well? So, what is cannabis? You'll notice I'm going to say cannabis pretty frequently. I'm also going to mess up and say marijuana. I'm trying to avoid using the term marijuana because it's actually a pejorative term that has some racial overtones, and so I'm trying to move towards cannabis. It's also what the DSM says. So, obviously, all right, who can pronounce the active ingredient in cannabis? Okay. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That is THC. That's what is responsible for the psychoactive effect. But there are over 100 cannabinoids, which is CBD, CBN, CBA, and that whole spectrum of them. They're harder to isolate, harder to research, and not every strain has them in the same proportions. Obviously, CBD is one that you've probably heard a lot about. Different cannabinoids are associated with different effects. Now, if you talk about dosing, this is an extremely tough topic to talk about, and everyone is going to tell you differently what a typical dose is. So what I will say is that an oral dose of THC is from 2.5 to 20 milligrams, though it can be much higher. But keep in mind that you're also burning the flower at the same time, and so you're actually getting a lot less. You're getting more in the 3 to 12 range. This is in a typical joint. There are also terpenes. They're like a volatile oil, mostly responsible for the smell. There's some research that says they may be psychoactive, but most of it says probably not. Okay, modern cannabis use. You probably know most of this, but every edible you can think of, every oil and cream you can think of, concentrates we'll talk about later, bath salts, I mean actual bath salts, suppositories, anal and vaginal. The interesting thing about suppositories is I'm seeing a rise in use for people with inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and that kind of thing. And what's really interesting about this is you want a high, when you're trying to use this medically, you want what we call full spectrum, right? So as many cannabinoids as possible without THC absorption, because most of these people don't actually want to be high. And what's interesting is that when you insert it anally and you go into the large intestine, you can't actually absorb the THC. You don't have those receptors in there. So even if the suppository has THC in it, they don't have the receptors to get it. Okay, Cannamath, my favorite pun. So dosing is based on concentration. And if you look at old research, you're talking at 1.4% to 4% THC, and that's where a lot of the research that my students were citing, the harmlessness at. And I'm like, great. And then when you go to the store and you pick it up and you're asking for what was Cannabis Cup winner last year, you're not looking at 4%. You're looking at the high 20s, the low 30s. So what the industry has decided is a recreational dose is 1 10 milligram dose every 2 weeks. That is probably, it's very cautious because the half-life for THC is about 36 hours, so about a day and a half. It's part of the reason why withdrawal is not so acute is because it happens over a longer period of time. People that use 10 milligrams once a week probably aren't going to see themselves rapidly rise. in use. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's actually do some math. If I say 1 10 milligram dose, how do you translate that into about an 1/8 ounce bag of weed, right? So keep in mind that 1 gram is about the weight of a paperclip. And so for 15% concentration THC flower, you're looking at a very small amount. For 30%, you're still looking at a very small amount. So if a person buys a 1/4 ounce of 20% THC concentrated cannabis, then it's about 141 doses, about 5 a day, right? And remember that we're talking about 1 dose every 2 weeks is what industry is saying is safe. So this is a good way to actually understand when your clients are telling you how much they're using, to actually get a sense of what that is. Now, of course, when we're doing a substance abuse diagnosis, we're not talking about frequency and concentration of use, but it does give you a sense of, like, is that a lot? Because if you don't actually know, is that a lot, then you really have a hard time actually having a detailed discussion about this. Yes?
Can you elaborate what you mean by dose? Is that a hit? Is that a joint? Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, can I elaborate on what I mean by a dose? When I'm talking about dose, I mean any administration of 10 milligrams. So it will take a different amount of hits from a pipe or a bong or a joint to get to that 10 milligram dose. But what I'm trying to do is talk about the discrete effects that a certain amount of THC itself has on you. So if we go back a little bit, when they're talking about typical dose, we'll get back to it. This is supposed to be 1 normal hit on a normal joint, which you know as well as I do doesn't really mean anything. Okay, so this is where it starts to get...
Could you elaborate on what the word safe? Are we talking about carcinogens?
No. By safe, what they mean is you are insulated from the negative effects of tolerance and any of the other mental health things, right? You were probably not going to have significant harm at 10 milligrams every 2 weeks. You're not going to see tolerance need to increase dose. You're not going to see a drop in your neurotransmitters concordant with that. I will talk about how administration actually changes that shortly, though. So this is where it gets complex, and you're going to hear me contradict myself a couple of times on here. That's because the research contradicts itself. But bioavailability, meaning how much of the substance are you actually taking in, despite how much you're putting in yourself. So bioavailability of inhaled THC it widely varies. I have up here between 2 and 56%. That is how healthy are your lungs, how often do you do this, how hot is it when it comes in, how long are you holding your breath. So wildly varies here. Right? So if your clients are saying, like, well, I took 1 little hit or I took a huge bong rip, there really can be a huge difference in how much they're absorbing. Bioavailability of ingested THC, about 6 to 12%. So it's a shorter spread, but it is a little higher on the low end. Sublingual, under your tongue, 50 to 75%. So that's technically the most efficient way. You're going to get the highest amount of your dose into your system. Now, you've probably all heard can of butter, because when you want to actually make an edible, it has to bond with a fat. So all those movies where you see them actually eating the flower, they're going to get a really small percentage of THC because it's not fat bonded. It needs to be fat bonded. So what happens is that it actually adds an extra hydroxyl group. So when you are bonding it with fat and making it into an edible, it gets processed differently. So delta-9 THC crosses through your blood-brain barrier at a particular percentage, and while the field is still debating on it, at an edible, it's 20% to 300% more sort of efficient in that way. So the same dose that is made into an edible, technically, might be 3 times as powerful. The other thing that happens with edibles, it's not happening so much in specialty markets like Denver, but where people are making their own or where they're doing this on a large scale, it's often made with shake. Anyone know what shake is? Right, so it's the stuff in the grinder. If you're like trimming and clipping bud, then what's happening is you're doing it over a big screen, and all the trichomes are falling off. That's the like fuzzy little crystals that actually have the most of the THC and the cannabinoids in them. So what happens is that when they're making edibles, the shop sort of will actually just gather up all that dust, and then they'll make that into their edibles because it's efficient. It's a good way to use that product that isn't easy to sell because it's not on a pretty flower anymore. But what happens there is that where you're buying a particular strain of weed and it may have a certain profile of cannabinoids, maybe it's got 13 really primary cannabinoids. When you're doing shake, you're probably drawing from several different strains. So not only are you having a certain amount of THC, but you're hitting a much broader spectrum of the cannabinoids. So you may go from 13 cannabinoids in a given strain to hitting closer to 80, maybe even that 100 number because you're just aggregating from a bunch of different strains. Does that make sense so far? Okay. These are some basic questions that I like to use. Notoriously terrible reporters. They either underestimate their own use or they don't want to tell you. And so one of the easiest ways to get around this is to say, how often do you buy and how much do you buy when you do? Because while they may not track how much they're using in a given day, they can sure tell you when the last time they bought, how much they spent, and how much they were typically buying. They'll usually answer in grams or ounces, right? So you'll want to have some facility with that. 3.5 grams is 1/8 of an ounce. It's unlikely someone is buying less than 1/8 at a time. It's more likely now that you can go every day, right, in Denver, so it may be a little different. But in most places, buying less than 1/8 is uncommon. What's your source? Is it homegrown? Is it black market? Is it medical? That'll give you a sense of how strong this might be. Do you use concentrates, right? So be sure to ask when they say that they use weed or they have THC, are you smoking it? Are you using edibles? Where is it coming from? Because as you're learning, that actually changes quite a bit. And the thing I hear all the time is, well, yeah, I bought this much, but I share it with friends. And typically, in my experience, those friends are also buying and sharing, and so I don't, yeah. Okay, so we're going to go through some pictures, and I'm going to stay down here. For context, top left is brickweed, right? Likely on black market, probably pretty old. Sticks, stems, seeds, probably lower concentration. And these are the 2014, I think, Cannabis Cup winners. You have Alaskan Thunderfuck and Purple Urkel. Now, a connoisseur will sit here and tell you that you can glean what effects it's going to have by the colors and all sorts of things, and that is not what I'm here to do. But know that there is a significant difference between probably what you might have been educated on or what the old school clinicians think of, what all the people that trained me thought of as weed, and what's actually out there. So then we move to Keef. No one's ever told me how to spell it. I've seen it several times. But Keef is the trichromes that break off, right? So if your clients are grinding things up, these are going to fall through a screen and they're going to collect it. So it's going to be a higher concentration, but it's really hard to actually give you a number on what that might actually be because it depends on what they're actually grinding to get it. Hash is going to be approximately 60% THC. Dabs are going to be between 60 and 80. Dabs are the molasses consistency, butane extracted concentrates. And you'll need usually people will have a different rig for this. They'll have like a glass rig where there's a glass pan and they'll heat it with a butane torch. The difference when you start getting into this kind of concentrate is that it expands extremely rapidly in the lungs. You'll see a lot more coughing. It actually is much hotter when it goes in, so it's doing a little more damage to lungs. And if they're telling you that they're making their own dabs at home, this is really dangerous. Butane is heavier than air. It settles. And so what can happen is that someone can be doing their own extraction in a closed environment, and then their refrigerator kicks on, or their pilot light, it gets high enough to hit the pilot light in the oven, and you have an explosion. So if you have someone that is saying that they're doing this at home regularly, and you're not really sure that they're doing this in a safe way, this is a real danger. We don't see it as much in Colorado because there's so much access, but I do see it elsewhere. This is shatter. What does this look like? Glass, right? It's different color, but it looks like meth. So this is, it's still kind of waxy, but it's much harder and flatter. And you can get 90% concentrations. So compare this with the 1.4 to 4% concentrations that a lot of the early research was done on to 90%. What happens when your intoxication shoots really, really high really quickly? And that's what we're grappling with as a field right now, is when we're giving statistics based on how many people have a psychotic episode because of cannabis, how many people have an adverse reaction, we have to ask ourselves this question. Are we talking about 15% THC concentration bud, or are we talking about shatter? Which is something that I don't have good data on yet. Okay. I'm going to slow down a little bit here because this is where the meat of it is. How well can y'all see this in the back? Okay. So I'm going to say cannabis. Most of the time I'm referring to THC. When I am not referring to that, I will specifically talk about whether it's CBD or otherwise. So GABA is our brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning if you need to stop yourself from doing a thing, you're likely using GABA in some form. So impulse control, anxiety, perseveration, all of that is actually involved with this GABA system. And there's some correlation with sleep as well. You may have clients that are taking a GABA supplement, and it's usually prescribed for anxiety. So THC actually is an antagonist, meaning it reduces GABA both at the production point, at the presynaptic point, and at the postsynaptic. So remember, it's crossing across that synaptic gap. And THC, actually, the whole cannabinoid system acts as like it's called a retrograde signaler. Essentially, the postsynaptic, the receiving end, actually sends a signal up against the typical flow of the neuron. And so it can be difficult to actually say unequivocally this is what it does. But essentially, it really reduces the production of GABA. So you have people that feel this euphoria from some of the effects I'm about to talk about, and they feel like their anxiety is going down. But over time, their brain is getting this consistent signal to transmit and produce less GABA, so it starts to downregulate. And this is where you start to see tolerance and dependence develop, because people are coming off of it, and they're like, I felt better on it, and now I'm more impulsive than I was, or I'm having a harder time sleeping than I was, or I'm more anxious than I was before. Right? So clearly the weed was helping. Dopamine, now it doesn't actually act directly on dopamine. Dopamine's a big part of that reward system. What's interesting is that THC tends to act on what's called the CB1 receptors, which are in your central nervous system, and CBD tends to act on the CB2 receptors, which are more in the peripheral nervous system, a lot of them in the immune system. Now, THC also does touch the immune system, but the dopaminergic neurons, the ones that produce dopamine, don't actually have CB1 receptors. But they are they're inhibited by GABA. So if I have a bunch of THC in my brain that is reducing how much GABA is being produced, then what's happening is I'm actually freeing up all these receptors to produce dopamine. So I don't actually directly produce it, but I remove the limiting factor for it. Anandamide. It's often called the bliss molecule. It's another cannabinoid. It is a partial antagonist. So it does actually reduce how much anandamide is in the brain. Interestingly, people with natively higher levels of anandamide don't actually like weed as much. They don't see the same benefits. And here's where this gets contradictory, is if I'm reducing the presence of the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA, what I'm doing is making it easier for the brain to get excited. That's part of the reason, that and flooding it with dopamine, that's part of the reason why we're sort of lowering that pleasure threshold. Food feels like it tastes better, music is better. But on the other end of this, when I'm reducing anandamide, the way that there's an enzyme that it interacts with that actually reduces the excitability of the brain. So this is one of those places where I'm contradicting myself. But what I will say is that from everything I can tell, the GABA effect is much larger than the anandamide effect. So you can typically think of this as actually increasing the brain's excitability threshold. Okay, so it's a partial agonist for serotonin. There's some argument on this, but it does seem to stimulate the release of serotonin. And there's some debate on what it does for monoamine oxidase. If you remember, monoamine oxidase is the enzyme that clears the synaptic gap, and it was the old school antidepressant because if you stopped it from clearing the synaptic gap, you gave dopamine and serotonin more time to be absorbed. And we'll come back to serotonin in a second. Norepinephrine. So this is part of adrenaline, right? This is a really complex effect. So in low doses, THC suppresses norepinephrine. And by low dose, I mean 10 milligrams or less, usually. Now, that's dependent on the person and tolerance and all of that, but it tends to suppress norepinephrine. High doses tend to increase norepinephrine. And this makes sense because at low doses, THC is technically a sedative. At moderate doses, it's a stimulant. And at high doses, it looks like a hallucinogen. So if anyone ever comes across and says, weed is this class of drug, it's actually not, because it's dose dependent. So here's what's really fascinating. This is all rat model studies. If you give someone, if you give a rat model high doses of THC, the amount of norepinephrine in their system does increase. But they have a technique for electrically stimulating the release of norepinephrine, which is analogous to, so people with PTSD tend to have higher sort of state levels of norepinephrine. And so you can think of this as what might happen if they're having a re-experiencing event, or if they're triggered, or people that are chronically distressed and have these really strong activating events. So what's really interesting here is that it does increase how much norepinephrine is in their system, but it also somehow inures them against those activating effects. So even though they may have more norepinephrine in their system, they're less likely to be reactive to other external stimuli that might produce norepinephrine. Do I need to restate that? Okay. And then the other thing that happens is this same study wanted to see, does psychological distress have an effect? And so this is again a rat model, but essentially they had them living in normal living conditions. They gave them high doses of THC, and it did increase their norepinephrine. And then they did a study where they put them in adverse living conditions for 48 hours. I don't know what that is, but I trust their definition of that. And it didn't increase norepinephrine. I can't tell you confidently why. But think about this for your clients that are chronically stressed, that have really strong comorbid issues, or they have environmental factors. They may not actually have the same effect, or they may not actually be feeling the same negative effects that someone that is, quote-unquote, healthier might have from high doses of THC. That doesn't mean that they should do it. There's all sorts of other things that are going on. But this is really important to understand, that we can't make a blanket statement about what THC does for norepinephrine. Okay. So how am I doing on time here? So we'll talk about specific disorders. I see this a lot with ADHD, all of the things up there, but they're trying to cope with the stress. There's all this information out there that says it's not as bad as alcohol, which lethality-wise it's not. There's all sorts of things that say it helps with anxiety and depression, and in some ways it does in the short term, but it can make things worse in the long run. there's a high degree of defensiveness around this, often because people, A, usually have a positive experience, and B, they can go online and find a myriad of information saying that this is okay and this is a good idea and here's the specific cannabinoids you need in what concentration and take it what day to help fix this. So my approach with my clients is never weed's bad. It does not work. The finger waggling does not work. It's why is it not working for you? Maybe even what did it do for you initially that it might not be doing as well anymore? Let's talk about this in a real way. Let's have a conversation. So about 8% of first-time users have a psychotic episode. And then, of course, if they have a psychotic history, that makes that number much higher. For every psychotic episode you have, you're about twice as likely to have another one. Interestingly, chronic, long-term, very heavy users are about 4 times as likely to develop schizophrenia as the general population. But let's keep in mind that even a 4-fold increase is only increasing. It's like a 0.25% to about 60.6%. So it's not a huge incident rate, but it is worth noting that if you have a client that is vulnerable and has any sort of psychotic disorder, this is not recommended. But one of the tough things about this is CBD is actually a mild antipsychotic. So you have a plant that within it can have a high concentration of a psychotic agent and an antipsychotic agent. And so part of what I will see is that people will tell me that they had a bad experience with it, or they were anxious, or there's all these context-dependent things about why they don't want to link a psychotic episode to the weed that they were using. But without knowing what profile that specific strain they were using is, we can't actually tell whether it was. So part of what happens is that they'll have they'll smoke once, and it may happen to be a high CBD strain, and they're like, I feel better, right? I actually feel more grounded. And then they'll smoke again, and it'll be low CBD and high THC, and they'll be off the rails, and they'll attribute it to something context dependent, right? So I'm not recommending that you go back and ask them exactly what they're doing, but when you are trying to tease out, is this psychosis induced from medication or from substance, or what's happening here, know that the same person can have a different reaction to different strains all the time. And that's part of where this can get really challenging. Okay, so let's just put this out there. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine did a meta-analysis and shows that there's strong evidence for THC use with chronic pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and multiple sclerosis and muscle spasticity. Moderate evidence for short-term sleep outcomes, obstructive sleep apnea, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. So obstructive sleep apnea is an interesting one. I think a lot of times when people are talking about it helps me improve their sleep, it's actually helping improve an underlying condition, because it does actually make sleep worse. But serotonin is implicated in obstructive sleep apnea. And so if you've got a medication that is increasing serotonin in your blood, that might be why it's helping. Future investigation is autoimmune conditions. So there's recent evidence that THC stimulates the release of a particular immune cell that actually suppresses the immune system and can make long-term cannabis users more vulnerable to certain types of cancer. And that's counter to a lot of the narrative that I know that I've heard. So part of my interest here is that we need to be careful about what we say. So it may actually put you at more risk for certain cancers, but if you have clients that need an immunosuppressant, why not one that is well tolerated, that is endogenous, and typically has relatively small side effects, right? So keeping in mind that that we can't make blanket statements here, but I will say that it does put people at risk for certain types of cancer.
Question?
Yes.
So that's the THC, not the CBD?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Okay. So ADHD, I'll speak real briefly on this one. But one of the things that we know about ADHD is that people don't produce enough of a particular brain wave in their frontal lobe. They don't produce enough alpha in their frontal lobe. If any of you are into neurofeedback, you'll see, you can actually see it pretty clearly on a QEEG. And so they will use for the first time, and they have this profound experience of their brain slowing down, of it feeling manageable, of not feeling like they're grasping at their thoughts all the time. And that is, it's really intoxicating. And so that can be one of the things that really drives people with ADHD or other sort of executive functioning issues to be attracted to this kind of thing. Because what's happening is that actually administration of THC does help produce alpha waves across the brain. But so does meditation, so does mindfulness, so does rhythmic repetitive movement. So think of all the ADHD clients you have that are shaking their leg. That's a natural compensatory mechanism. Think of, there's all these studies that say that kids with ADHD literally remember more if you allow them to pedal a bicycle or bounce on a ball during class. We're doing the same thing. We're actually stimulating alpha production through rhythmic repetitive movement. But this is a way in, is to talk about, I bet that gave you relief from something you didn't know you were suffering from until you tried this for the first time. My favorite thing to do when I was working at CU was to have my clients that told me that they were more creative on cannabis write down their ideas and then bring them to session and read them out loud. And they're like, I remember that being so much more interesting. So this is the other thing I see is high doses of stimulants for treatment of ADHD. Some people really need it, right? But they don't engage in the metacognitive stuff. So they're not actually using the other sort of thought-based skills to help align their focus where they want it to be. And so then they are using higher doses, which then is actually ramping up anxiety. And they're like, you know what? What'll take me down a notch is actually some weed. And so you get this back and forth where they're trying to find this sort of sweet spot of just enough stimulant, just enough depressant. And then, of course, they end up taking too much of one or the other. And then they can't focus on anything. I had clients that would spend 3 hours making the playlist that they were going to study to when they had 2.5 hours to study. How am I doing at time?
You're at 12:33.
Perfect. Okay, so anxiety and nonverbal learning disorder. I see a lot of NVLD. I don't know if that's something that y'all see quite a bit, but you have perseveration, you have anxiety with NVLD, you have rigid thinking, you have some tendency to miss social cues. So because there's a strong social component to this, you'll see people with anxiety and nonverbal learning disorder actually really drawn to this for a couple of reasons. It's social, and the expectations are low. People are supposed to be silly. They're supposed to laugh. They're supposed to watch SpongeBob, right? And that's something that people are like, I can manage that. It's all that complex back and forth talking where we're supposed to be communicating that they struggle with. And so I see people drawn to this. Again, the social demand is lowered. Now, cannabis is tough with anxiety because people will tell you immediately makes me anxious, or they'll tell you it's the only thing that helps my anxiety. And it's really difficult to predict that. So a lot of this is dose and potency, right? Are you using a low enough dose that you're having the sedative effect, or are you being told to use a high dose that is a stimulating effect and actually makes the anxiety worse? What's the cannabinoid profile of that particular strain? CBD, CBA, CBN, and a whole bunch of others. We don't have really good research on which ones have which effect, but know that might be what's happening, is that sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. So the person who tries it the first time and gets really anxious may have had a strain that didn't have enough of the cannabinoids that actually help reduce the anxiety. What's the social context? What's the type of anxiety? I typically have This is more anecdotal, but in my experience, I see people with the ruminative persevetive anxiety having more trouble with cannabis because they are more self-focused, more sensation-focused. And the ones that are more of the chronic sympathetic arousal tend to actually be the ones that tell you that the anxiety gets better, which makes sense because they may be using it at that sedative rate. What are they doing? And then, of course, acknowledging that GABA plays a role in this. Very common for people with depression to abuse cannabis, obviously. They're getting a ton of dopamine. It makes sense. And it also lowers that pleasure threshold. So go back to the excitability discussion and think about people that are anhedonic. They have trouble enjoying the little things in life. Suddenly, you make that enjoyment threshold a little lower. And so then they can enjoy things that they used to. And the unfortunate thing with that is that with cannabis and other drugs, anything that's changing that pleasure threshold is actually eventually raising it when you're sober. So basically, after you are abstinent from these drugs, the things that you used to get that little dopamine hit for, sunrises, holding hands, that kind of thing, doesn't even register. Now, that does come back down with time and sobriety and effort, but this is part of what keeps people stuck is on weed, I enjoy taking my dog for a walk. Off weed, my favorite band in the best concert in the world doesn't even register, right? So there's this sort of trap that happens. And then they can also tolerate some of the basic responsibilities. So they're at home doing some of those activities of daily living, feeling more productive. So the downfall is same rules of tolerance, dosage, dependency. But this is the one that really gets me, is this sort of passive stimulation. And since I work with older adolescents and young adults, they're at this time in their life where they're needing to launch, they're needing to find themselves. And what weed does in a very pure sense is it insulates people from boredom. Because when you lower that pleasure threshold, then you don't get bored watching Netflix. You don't get bored sitting on the couch. You don't get bored watching The Office for the 100th time. My wife might kill me because she does that anyways. But that's part of what happens. So it insulates you from that healthy boredom, which means you don't have that low-level anxiety drive to push you to do something, to pursue your own stimulus. And so it can be attractive to treat depression, but there's a lot that goes into it. And if I am insulating you from that sort of healthy desire to go and do things, we know that behavioral activation is one of the most effective ways of treating depression. So we're actually keeping people insulated from the boredom that might propel them to do the things that would lift them out of their depression. Okay, so research on sleep is mixed and ongoing. And the variance in the literature that you'll see is partly because of what I'm talking about, where every plant has a different sort of spectrum, and we don't know necessarily how the studies are dosing and what profiles of cannabinoids they have. But I can tell you in general, THC reduces sleep onset latency, meaning you fall asleep faster, and there's a temporary increase in slow wave sleep. So in that first week, people will say, I slept better, and they're actually right. If you look at polysomnographs, they will actually get more of that non-REM slow wave sleep. So they may really feel that they're getting better sleep and they're falling asleep faster. But it does decrease the quantity of REM. So rapid eye movement sleep, where one of the tasks of REM sleep is to actually move your memories through your brain and strip the emotional content of it, which is part of why it's so powerful in people with trauma or any of these really strong emotionally laden events. You need REM sleep. So if you're actually reducing the amount of time that you're sleeping in REM, you're preventing your brain from doing its natural housekeeping, from taking the painful sting out of those emotions. I talked about it might help with obstructive sleep apnea. The other thing is that your overall sleep time may increase with THC, but your sleep quality doesn't. So you're reducing your REM. The increase in slow wave sleep washes out after a week or so. You might still have the more rapid sleep onset latency. With CBD, this is really interesting. In small doses, it increases wakefulness. So because it helps with inflammation and pain, and because it's not psychoactive, people that are trying to be good about this will actually take CBD, but if they're taking the wrong dose, they're actually increasing wakefulness and messing with their sleep. So the study that I was reading said that at like 5 to 10 milligrams, it increased wakefulness. 15 and above, it tended to actually drop back into a sedative effect. And it may help REM behavior disorder. What that is people that don't fully enter into sleep paralysis during REM sleep, and so they're kicking their partners or moving, getting out of bed. So it actually has some pretty strong evidence that it may help that.
One other question.
Yes?
Can you explain briefly how it helps with sleep apnea?
The question was, can I explain how it helps with obstructive sleep apnea? So remembering that there are multiple types of sleep apnea. But when we were talking about the neurotransmitters, it does have that effect of being a serotonin agonist, meaning it increases the level of serotonin in your body. And for some reason, that seems to be an effective treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. I don't know why. I'm sure that y'all have heard this quite frequently. Cannabis is used to cope with or between other substance use. You've got the profound neurotransmitter depletion after psychedelic use, or having it help you cope with alcohol hangovers, nausea from psilocybin. And there's a tendency to see this as the innocent one, as the ibuprofen to your hangover. And while it may not be as deadly as some of the other ones, it is a sort of risky step to take. Now, I will say that the research does not suggest that cannabis is a gateway drug. They've done a ton of studies about that. It does not say that. But if you are using it to cope with the consequences of other drugs that you're taking, you're technically enabling your ability to take those other drugs more frequently with less consequence. Okay, so when we're looking at specific cognitive consequences, I work with young people that like to be smart. Or as they're crawling out of their depression, they want to feel like they're good at something. They don't want to feel like they've been stuck and stagnant. And so rather than coming at them from this, weed is bad approach, I'll ask, what frustrates you, right? Well, if I've got ADHD, I have, depressed processing speed, or my working memory struggles. And then I get to talk about, well, this is actually making it worse. The thing that bothers you most about yourself, or that you're most frustrated about, is actually made worse by some of your efforts to cope. So then it's not actually about weed being bad, it's about what it's doing. So it does show reduction in full-scale IQ. It does depress processing speed. It does inhibit working memory scores. This might actually be related to sleep. It might be, so in non-REM sleep, there's these sleep spindles, which are these really peculiar sort of electrical activities in your brain during that time. That may be why we're seeing working memory issues.
Question?
Yes?
Online, is there evidence that cannabis helps with opiate withdrawals?
Yes.
Repeat that, sorry.
Yeah, so is there evidence that cannabis helps with opiate withdrawals? Yeah, there are actually some studies out there talking about using synthetic cannabinoids to help with opiate withdrawals. So it may inhibit transmission of information from short-term to long-term. That's actually more about the sleep spindles. Research on perceptual reasoning scores is limited, but I suspect that it would be affected as well. All but the heaviest adult users typically regain their cognitive functioning within 12 months. So if you do the same psych scores at the beginning and end, they typically come back. So you get most of your functioning within 3 months, and at 12 months, it's almost undetectable. Depends on how bad the use was and if there's other comorbid things happening. So you can sell a lot of hope here. Yes, you have caused some injury to yourself. Yes, it does impact your ability to function, but it's not necessarily permanent. Now, I want to be really clear. This is on an adult model. The adolescent brain, and by that I mean 25 and under, has a vastly different effect. So if you have people telling you that it's good for them or that it doesn't harm them ask them what the age of the study participants were, because most of these are based on people that were healthy and 28 or 35, and they're doing these studies here. Okay, so I'd like to talk about some cannabis myths. I have cannabis cures cancer. It's not addictive. It helps you focus. It's not harmful. You can't OD from it. Vaping or edibles reduce all potential for harm, and I was talking with someone about that ahead of time. There's no withdrawal. What other myths do y'all have? Or things that you hear?
It's medication.
Mm-hmm.
It's healthy because it's natural.
It's healthy, yeah. Yep, healthy because it's natural. I mean, arsenic's on the periodic table as well.
It grows from the earth.
Grows from the earth. Yep. So does lithium, so everyone should be on bipolar meds. So let's talk about cures cancer. We talked about earlier that the very specific effect on one immune cell can actually make you more vulnerable. What I got actually wasn't that, though. What I got was people citing this one particular study that said that it's like an 80% reduction in tumor size after administration of THC. Now that is profound, right? And we should be very excited. One, it was a small study, but what my clients never actually read through beyond the abstract was how did they administer it? And in that study, they're actually directly injecting THC into the tumor body itself. I don't know about you, but I've never had a client that takes THC that way. It's not addictive. Clearly, if your brain changes its own production of its own native neurotransmitters in response to any outside substance, it can be seen as addictive.
Let's go back to there's a study out of New Zealand that says that smoking pot is more carcinogenic than smoking cigarettes.
Yes,
Seen that study?
I have. So there's several out there, and part of that is actually how long people hold the inhale. The comment was that there's a study out of New Zealand. You said that it says that smoking cannabis.
Also the combustion point. The higher the combustion point of any organic material, the more carcinogenic to the object.
Absolutely. So the combustion question is an important one. If you have someone saying they're using it for medical reasons, even if it's one that I've said might have some backing to it, if they are using it by combusting it, they are exposing themselves to so much more risk than any potential benefit. So usually my response to that is that if you are telling me that you're using it for medical uses, it better be a really clean vape, or it better be from an edible of some kind, right? So yeah, combustion kills. Now, it's pretty popular out here. Yeah.
Are there any risks? Question was, what are the risks for people using CBD drops for sleep?
So what are the risks for people using CBD drops for sleep? CBD, we're still studying it, and I don't have really good science on, beyond what I've already said about what it does for sleep, but what I can say is that low doses tend to increase wakefulness. High doses tend to have that sedative effect. So there is a risk of you trying to use it for sleep and not using the right dose for it. Okay, let's talk about can't OD from cannabis. Now, this one, when you talk about you can't OD, we talk about this thing called the LD50, the lethal death at 50%. So the first study that did this did it on 4% THC, and they found that you would have to smoke 1,500 pounds in, I think it was an hour period. That is a strong argument against overdose. I did some math, and if you actually go up to shatter and you calculate it at like the 90%, it turns out to be 67 pounds. Now, I don't know anyone that can do that. But it's remarkable that we went from 1,500 to 67 just from the concentrates. So you can get a much higher dose. And then you got to take other things into account. Are they taking other meds? Respiratory depression is what you're at risk for here. Because when you have that much of it, if you're not going psychotic, you're usually over-sedated. So you're going to split on one of those two branches at that really, really high concentration level. So technically, the science says that probably not, but it is a much higher risk with the concentrations we have now. Vaping or edibles reduce all potential for harm. That's where I was going to go with the combustion question. And there's also this other thing with inductive versus convective vapes. So inductive vapes are just burning it with a tiny coil instead of a lighter. And so even if someone's telling you that they're vaping, if they're using that kind of vape, they're still combusting the material. A convective vape is like a little oven that will allow you to control the temperature. And the reason that that quote-unquote works is that the trichromes vaporize at a lower temperature than the plant material does. No withdrawal. So if your half-life is 36 hours, then you're not going to notice the acute effect probably for a day and a half. Now, if you're at a more extreme end of use, you're going to notice it more quickly. But this is part of why this myth persists, is because people are going to they're going to stop using, and they're going to be a little more irritable, a little more tired, a little less hungry, and maybe a little more anxious. And they're just going to be like, it was an off week. It's really easy to miss that withdrawal at the lower levels. I have a little more on withdrawal. So they're going to experience the most acute withdrawal in the first 3 to 10 days. Days 4 to 7, you actually see something like REM rebound. So remember, THC shrinks the amount of time that you're in REM. Your brain desperately needs REM. And so it will rebound. It's similar to what you see in chronic alcoholics, where you have that breakthrough REM. They're actually having dreams in non-REM. But you see that sort of REM rebound, because eventually your brain says, I need REM sleep. So they have really intense dreams. They have decreased appetite, anhedonia, poor sleep. This one is the single most common reason for relapse of people that are trying to come off of weed, because poor sleep can last 45 days. So your average user is going to feel pretty good on that 10th day. They're going to be in that pink haze, pink cloud of recovery. And then when they're coming out of that, that pink cloud, that pink haze, they're still not really sleeping. So they're going to be, at the end of their first month, going, you know what? I've licked this thing. I'm going to just go back to using it for sleep, because I'm still not sleeping well. And that's where you start seeing people diving back in. Irritability, anxiety, impulsivity, poor focus. Higher users are going to see sweats and aches. 2 weeks, most people begin to re-regulate. At 30 days, most people start to feel more normal. And that's, again, where that risk for relapse increases. So much is dependent upon this. So it is fat bonded. So it gets stored in your fat, meaning people with a higher BMI are going to take longer. People that have a slower metabolism, don't exercise as much, are poorly hydrated. All of those things impact how quickly someone is going to come out of that.
I've also read that it could alter your liver enzymes. So there's truth to that, and what does that exactly mean?
The question is, does it alter your liver enzymes in some way? I don't actually know. I'd have to look that up. Sorry. Yeah. Have y'all encountered, now I have no idea how to pronounce this correctly because I got the wrong degree, but cannabinoid, it's either hyperemesis or hyperemesis. Have y'all encountered that? Yeah. So these people are nauseous, they're vomiting, they're in pain, and they have compulsive bathing. They want to be in the bath all the time. That's the hallmark of this particular disorder, because they, for some reason, react so poorly to THC and other cannabinoids that they stop being able to regulate their temperature. And so they have this compulsive drive to bathe. Not to be confused with self-care of taking an hour-long bath at night. This is different. We're talking like hours and hours every day at all times of the day. Okay, so how to talk about sobriety, harm reduction, classic motivational interviewing. I also love this cast metaphor. It's one I started using a while ago, but you have to honor what it did for them. You have to honor the function. You have to honor maybe even the lessons they learned from it, right? Maybe they learned to slow down. Maybe they learned to appreciate the smaller things. But like a cast, while after an injury you need that support, if you leave it on too long, the muscle underneath starts to atrophy. Because like anything, if your coping skill happens like that, the other coping skills that take time and effort and practice and maintenance are suddenly far less attractive. Why am I going to spend all this time and effort meditating to produce alpha waves if I know that I can take an edible and produce alpha waves? Right, so I love this metaphor of the cast because most people can relate. It makes sense to honor what it did and why you got there and what was important to you about it. But also, it's a really vivid image of having the rest of your skills sort of atrophy. Appeal to their pride, their ambition, to a specific skill that may have gone on the wayside because they haven't been bored enough to pursue it. Like, when's the last time you picked up your guitar? What are the risks of relapse to your life goals, your relationship, your mental abilities? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I feel like y'all may have a grasp on that. So a couple of resources for you. Reddit can actually be a really good source. So this community thinks they're funny, and this is for people who are leaving cannabis use, and so it is R leaves. Yeah. Because the pro-cannabis subreddit is trees, and trees have leaves, and okay. But it's actually really good. There's a ton of support on there. If you're having someone who's in that sort of pre-contemplation, contemplation stage, have them read through this, because there's a lot of people that are telling their story and talking about the ways that they talked themselves in and out of it. This website has the 30-day self-help guide. It is beautiful. It's what to expect day 1, day 2, day 3, and tasks that they can do. If you want to learn about where your clients are getting information about substances, bluelight.org, drugs-forum.com. There's a million other places now. Okay. I wanted to leave time for questions. I know that was a lot of information, so please let me know if I need to reiterate.
Yeah. I'm just really interested around like CBD, just because I hear it talked about, I mean, in and out of AA meetings of the treatment community, whether you should use it, shouldn't, even from folks that don't even do drugs and alcohol, like curious about it.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like first off, do you guys allow it over at Open Sky?
We do not.
Okay. And is there certain CBDs that you know have THC properties and certain that don't?
So,
it's hard to know what you're getting into when you're purchasing it.
yeah, it is hard to know. In legalized states, especially recreational ones, there's a lot more information. They're required to put the breakdown of what potency and particulars they have on it. So it's not too hard to go out there and find something that has mostly CBD and doesn't have THC in it. CBD is interesting. It is really powerful. It's pretty well tolerated. It doesn't have a psychotic effect. We don't tend to downregulate as quickly our own neurotransmitters to it. But I'll say that we're just not there yet. We're not there where I can say yes. The other thing to think about, too, is what we know about substances in general is that the addiction potential is just as related to how quickly you feel the effect as it is to the substance itself. So the same substance taken intravenously is going to be more addictive more quickly than if it takes you 2 hours through an edible. So when I talk with recovery guys and when I talk with people that have to deal with this question, it's maybe CBD itself isn't harmless, but why have a vape on my person that can immediately solve the moment-to-moment issue? Because all I'm doing is reinforcing that neural pathway to sort of immediate gratification. And that's sort of the discussion I hear. But I also won't stand up here and say that it's got no potential interesting effects. That would be irresponsible of us to dismiss it entirely.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm amazed at how it's just everywhere right now. You go get a massage, before you know it, they're marking you down in CBD.
Yep.
I went to go order a coffee, and it had CBD, and I found out before I started having it, and I was like, you're not even, you guys not.
You dosed me and didn't tell me? Yeah.
And it has
Yeah.
THC in it too, and it's just shocking how it's like common
immediately normalized. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So when you have young adults who are struggling with anxiety, depression, ADHD, which it sounds like you see a lot of, they're self-medicating.
Yeah.
What do you offer them in the short term as incentive, like skill? What are you telling them to do to replace that?
Right. So the question is, what do you do to help people in that short term? Because this is a coping skill they have, right? And how do you help them go through that? I am spoiled in the wilderness, right? I know that they don't have access to it. I know that they can go and stare at Sleeping Ute Mountain. I know that they can go and like crush a pine cone and have a sensory experience. They're also in a community of other people that are struggling in other ways. And the very first thing that we do is we teach them as many coping skills as possible. We talk to them about sympathetic nervous system regulation. We talk to them about how different types of breathing actually help with that. And then we are just there. We're there through that first week where they're struggling. Sometimes for the worst cases, they'll get GABA to help them in the meantime, or our psychiatrist will prescribe trazodone to help them sleep, right? We don't want them suffering unduly. But generally, this kind of withdrawal is not going to kill you. You're just not going to be very happy about it. And then you think that they have to hydrate themselves. They are exercising. They're sleeping and waking with sun and resetting their circadian rhythm. So they're also helping their body recover alongside this.
So is there a correlation with addicted to cannabis and addicted to video games?
Is there a correlation between cannabis addiction and problematic video game use? Not that I'm aware of. I can't say that that is something I've seen studied. Are you thinking in terms of like impulse control?
Just if you are more prone to be high, you want to gain more, I guess, more coming from that.
I mean, there's often an overlap in those communities, but I would say that there are plenty of people who are doing both that are using cannabis that may not have like an actual issue with video games. But if you think about it, right, that it's a high stimulus activity with a drug that lowers your stimulus threshold. So often I do see them together, but I don't know that I could actually put any correlation in there.
You talked a little bit about the adolescent brain, the adult brain. Do we know how THC works on an aging brain versus an adult?
No, I don't. But what I will tell you is that there are some studies out there where they are using CBD for the positive symptoms of dementia. So for some of the like acting out behaviors, the emotional lability, there are a handful of places around the country that are using CBD at higher doses for that, and it seems to calm people down without. Right, because you don't want to give someone a hallucinogen if they're not able to track reality very well in the first place. But if you can give them something that's mildly sedative and probably better than some of the other meds they're on. Yeah. So I've seen that out there. I haven't seen any long-term efficacy studies on that, but there are people experimenting with CBD for dementia.
Question from online. Is CBD going to be the new opiate addiction, i.e. more and more people taking it for chronic pain because it's safe?
Oh, great question.
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Yes. So is CBD going to be the new opiate thing? If I could predict that, I would be a very rich man. But what I will say is that the difference between so opiates came from the particular ones of abuse came from a very specific source that had a vested interest in marketing it in a particular way, and they are currently being sued for that. CBD, I am unaware of a cabal of CBD activists that are spending the research out there. And I've seen nothing that points to the same level of addictive potential for CBD.
What are your thoughts on medical marijuana, or people getting recommendations for that, and with it being recreational, Do you think that's going to go away eventually?
So what are my thoughts on people getting medical marijuana prescriptions, and do I think that the recreational market will change that? The recreational market is already changing it. There are already medical stores that are closing, especially around Colorado Springs area. I will say that there are limited conditions out there that are treated very effectively with cannabis. And if we're talking about like a harm reduction model, if you have a very severe chronic condition that is impacting your ability to sleep and to function, and you have access to something like that that helps, then you have to ask, are the potential consequences that are real and that are there, like that's a decision you make ideally with a good doctor whose whole point isn't to sell those prescriptions. But it is something that has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and understanding that it's not a panacea. I really don't think people that are depressed and anxious should be doing it. It helps in the short term. It makes it all worse in the long run.
What research is out there related to, because of it becoming recreational, that it's reducing the stigma around use for adolescents and young adults? Like, what are the numbers? I don't know if there's any numbers.
I actually just read, there's just a study that I saw today. I didn't have time to dive into it. But their abstract basically said that there's several countries around the world that came together that have had recreational and other legalization things happen, and it showed no rise in teenage use after meta-analysis. So you may have somewhat of that prohibition effect, right, where it's no longer taboo, you no longer have to get it from these unsafe sources, and so people there's not as strong of a desire to do it earlier than they should. And I will say that there have been conflicting research. There was a report out in Colorado about like reduction in opiate use and a decrease in teen use after legalization, and then it was criticized for its very selective sort of methodology and the funding behind it. So right now, I would say I don't know enough to say so unequivocally, but I have also not seen evidence that says that we have a rising trend that we need to pay attention to. Colorado actually needs to pay attention to the tobacco vaping because we're leading the nation in underage tobacco vaping. Yeah, happily. Yep. Yeah, and if we want to end, I'll be around for a little while.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.